Okay, so I got a comment here that I think is very interesting and touches on some things that I've been wanting to discuss for a while. So this person is saying that they believe that there is a relationship between the prenatal and the Hegelian perspective and the postnatal and the Marxist perspective. And also notes that the Marx begins, which means in the northeast, with mountain, which is material reality, whereas the prenatal begins with spirit, which is thunder, also in the northeast. These are the same position. And I think that this is actually some really interesting stuff. So let's dive into it a bit. I want to discuss what is meant by the dialectic and what differs between the Hegelian and the Marxist. And I'm in no way claiming to be an expert on either of those thinkers. I have thought a lot about these particular ideas, and so I will share with you my perspective on it. The thing that I find a little strange is that whenever people talk about the Hegelian dialectic, they never seem to think of it in the terms that I find most interesting. So I guess this gives me an opportunity now to try to describe why I think it's such an incredibly profound idea. Now, fundamentally, the Hegelian version, you could say, is the abstract, which goes to the negation, which becomes the concrete. And what's being talked about here? My sense is that this is about the fundamental operations of consciousness. I don't know how any other way of saying it. And if you just look at what happens in the world, it's so obvious that that's exactly what's going on. When something is proposed, right, here's a proposition, immediately there is an opposition that arises. And we see this, very clearly nowadays. We think of our society as being particularly polarized, but I think that even in ordinary life, you'll notice that as soon as something is posed, it naturally creates some kind of resistance against it. Something rises up in opposition to whatever is proposed. This, of course, brings to mind Newton's third law of motion, which says that whenever something exerts a force on some other thing, it produces an equal and opposite force as a response in that second thing upon the first thing. So that seems to me to be a physical manifestation of this initial dialectical process of the abstract and then the negation. This happens in our own minds, I think, quite often. Certainly if you're a thinker. But I would say that just in general, what some people will do is they will suppress the shadow. They will suppress the thoughts that naturally arise that would contradict the thought that they are thinking. So that would be, considered doubt, I guess you could say. Doubt is basically this thing that arises upon thinking something. There is all of a sudden, well, am I thinking of it right? Some other possibilities arise, right? And I think that this is a recapitulation of one of the most fundamental laws of the universe, which I think of in terms of the incommensurate conjugate. Whenever something comes into being, it is inextricably linked with its opposite, with the thing which annihilates it. So from the point of view of quantum physics, there is this idea of the quantum foam, that in the vacuum there are these antiparticle pairs that are constantly being created, and that when they interact with each other, which typically happens within an infinitesimal fraction of a second, they annihilate each other. And so you could say that free space is teeming with, they call it a quantum foam, which is this continual potential, this kind of churning of possibility of something that could be, but ultimately ends up self-annihilating because it immediately encounters its opposition. Now, there are some other ideas about what's happening in free space that are not that model, but it is a model that's seriously considered, and I think it's a very interesting one. I'm not going to say that it's necessarily true, but I do think that the basic principle of the incommensurate conjugate bears itself out in all kinds of different ways in what we observe, both within ourselves and within the universe. So, in the electromagnetic world, you have the dielectric and the magnetic. So there is this relationship between these two things. They're inextricably entwined. The one produces the other, but they basically contradict each other. They are in opposition to each other. Then you have sort of the standard series of things that are referred to along these lines. So, light and dark. I mean, dark is just the absence of light, right? But so it's kind of not a thing. But it is the negation of light. So similar with hot and cold, right? So heat is basically movement. And so the absence of movement, stillness, right? It's a negation of movement. And so the Hegelian perspective is essentially, I think, fundamentally spiritual because it's concerned with consciousness. You have an abstract, which is this kind of, I'm going to say it directly relates to the model that I'm using in the trigrams. So this model here, I'm going to say that the abstract is imagination. It's something posed. You're posing a possible view, a possible image. And that negation, the thing which essentially rises in opposition to it, I'm going to say that's memory. I mean, this is a little weird, but think about what negation really means. A negative in a print, right? A print is like an impression, right? So you're getting the opposite, which is the thing that is the imprint. So think about a piece of clay, right? And there's like a stylus or something that marks the clay. The stylus is the opposite shape of the mark that's made in the clay. And I think this is one of the biggest problems that we don't really recognize when it comes to our own memories. Our memories are not the thing themselves. They are an impression. An impression is the opposite of the thing that pressed into it. So in a way, everything we remember is a mirror image of the thing that happened. And you could say that the result of this interaction between incommensurate conjugates is the concrete, is the real. It's the reality of what's going on. There's a result from the interaction between the proposition and the opposition. And that is called the concrete in Hegelian terms. So this would be Hegel here. But then we have, of course, Marx. And what did Marx do? You could say that Marx actually was a concretization of the spiritual idea of Hegel. Marx was fundamentally a materialist, and his dialectic was called dialectical materialism. And you could say that maybe that has something to do with the fact that Marx was essentially impoverished for most of his life. My sense is that Marx was someone who was constantly on the verge of completely losing it, and often didn't have enough for his wife and children. A man who truly dedicated himself to his ideas, so he had this kind of, he was very wrapped up in the psyche, which is something which is, the world of ideas, which I think is more kind of spiritually related than materially, but because of that, he was in a protracted state of material deprivation. And so he became kind of consumed by his material concerns. It's kind of ironic. If I remember correctly, if I remember the biography of Hegel, he had some moments of uncertainty, but he did manage to land himself a pretty cushy gig for a while, or really eventually, that lasted for the rest of his life. So he managed to find his way into a life of relative comfort. So there's something to be said about that. The fact of the matter is that if you have the material underpinnings set pretty well, then you have the leeway to explore the realm of the mind without all of the worry, without all of the doubt. I mean, there still may be some doubt, but it's not as visceral if you're living on the edge, right? And the other thing that's worth mentioning about this dialectical process, I think it's recursive. So, you basically end up with some kind of result coming out of this process between the proposition and the opposition, and that kind of gets fed back into this dialectical, the whole dialectical process is that there is a proposition which gets negated, they kind of battle it out, and the result is it's the concrete reality of that battle. That's what I think Hegel was sort of saying. And in the battle, the abstract and negation kind of get lost. It's like what happens in politics, where there are ideological principles which, in the process of battling them out, they get abandoned and lost and corrupted and twisted, and all kinds of various weird things happen. The next thing you know, the people who started by representing themselves as being in favor of one particular thing, they're in a completely different position. They just get all turned around. And that's the reality. That's the concrete result of it, right? And that can then be pointed to in making a proposition. But the thing about Marx is that he turned it into something that was more concrete or, materially oriented. Because actually the thing that's funny about the material world is that it's really not concrete. Now, the reason I say that is because, first of all, the material world is continually transforming. And so one way to view it is that the material world is always slipping away from us. We're trying to hold on to it like our bodies. We're trying to preserve our bodies and stay healthy. I mean, some of us are, right? But the body is slipping away from us, and it will be gone. And the same is true of all material configurations. But it's also the case that the people who have examined the material world as closely as we possibly can have come to recognize that most of it is nothing. The atom consists of mostly space, emptiness. There's something fundamentally empty and not concrete about matter. Whereas you could say in the spiritual domain, the thing which is most concrete is the fact that there is an experience happening. And that is the eternal soul, the eternal Godhead is essentially the endless well of experience of the beings in this universe. And we can only speculate how far that goes. We know concretely that we're having experiences. And I think it's pretty obvious that we know that others are having experiences. And when I speak of others, I'm saying not just human others. I know my dogs are having experiences. I know my cats are having experiences. I know my chickens are. And pretty much everything, insects, plants, I think, too. I know some people don't believe that. Some people don't believe that plants are consciousness, but I see no reason to think that they wouldn't be. And then there are some people like Rupert Sheldrake who have speculated that the sun is conscious, so it's having an experience, right? There are some panpsychists who believe that every atom is essentially a form of consciousness. And when it comes to some sort of an explanation as to why things would respond, because that's in essence what every bit of matter does, it's responding to something, right? Consciousness is the greatest mechanism you can imagine. So you can imagine that every element has its own kind of form of consciousness that's very dedicated to a particular type of reaction. And indeed, there are some living things that have pretty predictable types of reactions, right? They're having an experience. It may not be the kind of experience that we think of as being an interesting experience, although I bet it would be interesting. Any of these experiences would be incredibly interesting to compare to our own experience, our human experience. But we tend to be very anthropocentric, and so we sort of think of human experience as being the most important experience. But that's just our hubris, really. And I think that attitude has gotten us into a lot of trouble and will continue to get us into a terrible amount of trouble. So, and then there's the question, of course, of whether or not our constructions are going to be having an experience like AI, that sort of thing. There's some good reason to think that it would and some good reason to think that it wouldn't. I have no idea. But I can see there are good arguments for both sides of that question. But yeah, this is all to say that fundamentally, experience is way more concrete, even though we don't know what the content of the experience is. Because the content of the experience is related to the phenomena, is related to matter. But the fact of the experience itself, that is the thing which is concrete. It's like the enclosure within which all this stuff is happening. It's a very real thing. And in this sense, like the enclosure is the thing which is peering out into phenomena. So you can think of, in essence, like spirit is something which, like the Taoists say, the mind is the ruler of the body, and the spirit is the treasure of the mind. So you can think of the mind as having this gift, the jewel, which is experience, conscious experience, being, in essence, and that it is experiencing this phenomena which is ever-changing and slipping away and is not concrete. So that's the funny thing about, the material. Material is empty, and I think that's why it's associated with yin. So the way it's usually referred to here is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. They're, it's just different terminology. It basically says the same thing, but from Marx's point of view, all of it is determined by material configuration. Because from Marx's point of view, the psyche, consciousness, is essentially subject to material conditions. Whereas I think from the Hegelian point of view, and I can't say this authoritatively, I'm not a student of Hegel, but my sense is that the belief there is that consciousness is far more fundamental. And so that would be a more spiritual perspective. And the material is something which follows conscious. And I think actually there's a dialectical relationship between consciousness and material. That in essence, the Hegelian relationship can be seen as being a relationship between the spiritual consciousness and the material phenomena. So at any rate, let's take a look at how this might be viewed within the Bagua. So if we think of this prenatal as being Hegelian, here we have thunder, so we can see how it maps out specifically. That bottom line, which is on the inside of the prenatal, is the abstract. Top line is the negation, the memory. And the middle line, which is the present, the sense, the thing which is happening, that's the concrete. Right? And here we have, as mentioned by the commenter, this is thunder. So we have the beginning of the cycle here in the northeast, below the horizon, right? Where it starts with the abstract. And then note that the next thing that happens is that you have the negation show up. Isn't that convenient? Right? Now, I don't know if I can go all the way through and explain why this would be a representation of the process of the Hegelian dialectic. I could try. I mean, here we have the concrete showing up next. And it's interesting to note that in this first phase, we have the abstract underlying the entire process on the way up, right? So it suggests that, and then what it suggests is that at a certain point, that abstract gets lost. And then you're kind of left with the operations without that initial imaginative thing present. So the original idea gets lost. And it's fascinating that you have here Earth, in essence. You have a moment where, in a sense, everything has been forgotten. Right? You're not sure what the original idea was. You're not sure what the idea was that was fighting against it. And then you're not even sure what it was that came out of it. Because you'll notice that the concrete gets lost here. The last thing that remains, actually, is the negation, I suppose you could say. And it may be that here, mountain in the northwest, at the very end, is really the negation of this most concrete thing. Because you're left with the concrete here in the west, right? But then even that concrete thing fades, which is fundamentally, I think you could say, that's what happens within the mind constantly. Like, every time you have a realization, there's a realization, it arises, and it's very vivid, and then immediately it gets thrown into memory, because otherwise you would forget it. And as soon as it's in memory, it's not the thing anymore. It's just an impression of the thing. And the thing may be still there, but now it's in a dialectical relationship with that memory. And then something starts to form as a result of it. It's not really just that abstract anymore. There is some other kind of result that's happened, and you're starting to get some distance from it. Now, here, I think you would have this moment where there's sort of the way I've been describing it is that when you get to this phase, it's actually kind of been born into the world, because this is the creative, right? Heaven. So when abstract, concrete, and negation are all coincident, right? Then something is really taken hold in the universe. It's appeared as an entity. It's been created. It's been born. But then, the original thing is forgotten. And in essence, you could say what you have now is a memory of the concrete. Well, the memory and the sense are married here, and then they separate. So it gets forgotten, and so then there's just the feeling of it, and then there's not even the feeling, and there's just this residue. It's like a residue of a process that you went through, which is fundamentally a negation of the whole process, because you've lost it somewhere around the way, right? Isn't that what's continually happening in the world of ideas, in the world of philosophies, in the world of spirit? Trying to maintain that spiritual state. Okay, maybe there are some great sages who have managed to, what do they say, never leave their sacred ground? That's what they talk about in the gold elixir. You're a fool if you don't refine it, and that the primary goal is to never abandon that alignment within the gold chamber, so that the reception of the Tao is always as complete as possible. I am sure that there are people who have attained a good measure of that. Part of it, of course, is the recognition of this pattern, I believe. Because without the recognition of the passing of all of these things, you can't really fully come to terms with the futility of all of the activity of the mind. So all of that seems extremely fundamental. Let's just take a quick look here at the materialist point of view here in the postnatal. And so here it's the opposite way around. You can't see quite as clearly, but this is now the bottom line on the outside in the postnatal. So that's the thesis, right? The antithesis, the top line, is now on the inside of the circle, and then the synthesis is here in the center. And so if we, again, think about this position here, this is now the top line, so this is mountain, and so this is, in essence, the antithesis, right? And, one of the things that's kind of interesting to consider here is that from Marx's point of view, Marx's entire philosophy is based upon anti-capitalism. He is responding against something. He is motivated. The beginning of his activity starts with the negation of the capitalist perspective. Right? Isn't that essentially what he starts with? So, yeah, he's against it. Whatever it is, I'm against it. I don't care what they have to say. It doesn't matter anyway. Whatever it is, I'm against it. No matter what it is or who commenced it, I'm against it. Hats off to Groucho Marx. So there's something about the material world that is predicated on starting with something that's against it. You're against it. What's the matter? It's the thing we're struggling against. That's the thing about the material world, right? We're all struggling against it. We're in it, but it's getting in the way of everything. But it's the only thing we have with which to work with. And we have to struggle in order to work with it. It's against us. That's what the matter is. Here's something that's interesting. It immediately flips to the thesis. So when you're against something, what you have to do to come up with next is some kind of alternative. So in the case of Marx, that would be communism, right? His idea was that the thing that he was against, there was a solution that he was proposing. He posed it. And he sure did meet a lot of resistance. And you could say, it's interesting to note also that he really played it all the way through to the end before communism actually made an appearance on the world stage. Like, not only did he have to develop his ideas all the way, but he died before you saw the birth of the communist movement. But here, this position in the South with fire, you see that the idea has taken hold. So I would say that this is where he synthesizes a notion of an alternative, but within the context of the antithesis, what he's really concretizing is his argument against capitalism. And it's the argument against capitalism that convinces the world of this idea. This is sort of like the appearance of the notion of communism here, but it's still just an idea. It hasn't really synthesized yet, but the pamphlets are starting to go around. People are getting excited about it. People are all like recognizing the criticism against capitalism. And, once it kind of makes its appearance, of course, then it's going to be undermined rather quickly. There's a lot of resistance within the existing world to new ideas. And, but then, it slowly kind of picks itself up again. So here is, you could say, in essence, the rekindling, in this case, of the new idea, this thesis that communism is possible. Synthesis has occurred because of the lasting power, and you'll notice that synthesis works its way all the way through to the very end here, right? And the thing that's fascinating here is that once it makes its stamp in the world, so on its way out, it's like a final gasp where it actually makes this, it's born on the world stage here, you could say. It's lost. It's both the the criticism of capitalism and the idealism of communism, all that's left is the synthesis, which is essentially like Stalinism. So, the thing which came out of Marxist ideas, he was great when it came to criticism of capitalism. That is the recursive part of the story. So there was a dialectic that produced capitalism, and I would say that had something to do with the shifting of power from kings to nations, and the transference from primarily a warfaring method of going about gaining power and influence to an economic method. And so that is essentially the seeds of capitalism, where instead of marauding armies, you had a bourgeoisie class that were engaged in commerce. And so it was on the basis of, you would say, really a cooperation between military and economic forces. So good on the criticism of capitalism, but then, this new idea that gets posed, right, communism, it goes through a variety of theoretical variations. It makes its entrance on the stage here at the end of this dialectical process, you could say. And what it spits out ultimately is the synthesis, which is essentially the political reality, the real politic of what ends up happening after the Cultural Revolution, which is the nightmare of Stalinism. The nightmare of Maoism, right? The reality of the result of the revolution, which is a materialist expression of that process. Because as long as you're kind of in the ivory tower, you can play the same process out without the material consequences. So you can have arguments about ideas without millions of people suffering. I think that it's not always very clear cut. So, from my point of view, the prenatal and the postnatal are also incommensurate conjugates. They cannot be separated from each other. They are both continually active. It's just a matter of perspective. And we can view things through the prenatal lens, but we can't avoid the postnatal from also being a factor, and vice versa. We can view things as if the material story is the primary one, but that doesn't change the fact that there's a spiritual reality to everything as well. So I know this kind of went all over the place. I think there's some interesting stuff here. I hope that you found it worth the time. And I'll just say one more thing, that the diagrams, I believe, are an excellent way of thinking about this dialectical process writ large, in the sense of the relationship between the observer and the phenomena. I don't know if there's anything else really to say about this, except if you found this interesting, I hope that you will consider sending it along to others who may find it interesting. Hit the like button, write a comment. If you want to keep track of the stuff that I'm doing, I think I should mention, so what I've been telling people to do is to sign up at TAIJIREALITY.substack.com. Now, that's where I've been doing everything, and I think that some people who are interested in this material are not interested in some of the other things I've been doing. So I apologize that there are other things that I announce on the Taiji Reality Substack. And for the time being, I'm just going to keep it that way. But maybe what I'm going to do eventually is to separate things out, so that the Assembly of Silence, which is my podcast, that'll be a separate thing. Taiji Reality will be its own thing. And there are a couple other things that I do which may also be separate projects. But for now, it's all just thrown into taijireality.substack.com. I apologize if you get stuff that you don't find interesting. it would be helpful if that's an issue, if you would let me know before I do all the work to make these things separate. It would be great if I got feedback saying, hey, you know what? I don't want to hear about this other stuff. I'm only interested in TAIJIREALITY. That would be really helpful before I spend all the time necessary to set things up that way. So putting that out there, if you want to materially support these efforts, you may do so at that Substack, taijireality.substack.com, or you can do it at patreon.com/TAIJIREALITY. You can also send me PayPal at taijireality@gmail.com, taijireality@gmail.com. I think I've got a Venmo thing somewhere. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out all the various things I'm supposed to do in order to be a contender in the attention economy. And I obviously have a lot to learn along those lines. So without wasting any more of your time, we'll call this the end of this video. And until next time, adios.